This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool ECHO.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Blood Red podcast with me, Matt Addison. Alongside me, first of all, for this football finance special on the Blood Red channel is Price of Football podcaster and University of Liverpool lecturer Kieran Maguire. Liverpool aren't going to sign a central defender this January, but how big a risk would that be financially, and are they being overly cautious? Well, we'll get started straight away and dive into some of the topics we're going to go into, Kieran. I hope you're well. Let's start with the obvious question. I mean, how big a risk is not signing somebody this month for Liverpool? And if they were to miss out, say, on the Premier League title or on the top four, how much would they then stand to lose?
Qualifying for the Champions League is far more of a critical issue than winning the Premier League, because as we saw with Liverpool's finances in 2019, when they won the Champions League, it was worth over £100 million in TV money. They then had 7 home games at Anfield, which realistically were bringing in another 30, plus bonuses from sponsors for getting that far in the tournament. So top four is essential from a financial perspective when you're a club of the calibre of Liverpool, and you've got the overheads that go with that. So I think that will be the focus, and Jurgen Klopp has been hinting at that in some of his recent interviews. Therefore, investing in players always has benefits in the sense that it can reinvigorate a squad, but it comes at a financial cost. Liverpool do have the ability to go out and buy a player. That for me is of no doubt. But if I look at the fundamentals of finances, yes, they've been hit by COVID along with every other club. But the impact that has had, if we take a look at the European market, is that transfer prices have fallen by a third across UEFA's borders. And therefore, there is the opportunity to buy players for lower prices. I think that the driving issue is Jurgen Klopp will probably be looking at the position in 6 months' time. And if you're spending 40 to 50 million pounds on a central defender, then it could be a case of trying to squeeze 4 players into 3 positions or 3 into 2. And it can lead to dissatisfaction if a player's been signed and has been told that he's going to be a regular player and that doesn't materialise.
It sort of seems to me that in terms of getting into the Champions League and stuff like that, it would be a massive gamble, though, for Liverpool not to sign someone this window, even if it was a short-term stopgap, say for £4 or £5 million this window. That £4 or £5 million investment, if it gets them into the top four or it possibly even wins them the Premier League title, that would be instantly paid back, wouldn't it? It will be, but in doing so, it's effectively saying to the younger players that we don't have faith in you. And clearly there's a limited number of people that get to see the players in training on a day-to-day basis, to see how they're developing and to make a decision as to whether they are worthy of a first-team place on a regular basis. And clearly, I don't have the skill set or the knowledge to comment on that. In terms of a small fee, would you actually be upgrading on the players who are presently taking those places in the team? It could be that you sign a player for £4 to £5 million. He's not been playing regularly for his own team, so therefore it takes him another 3 to 4 weeks to get match fit. And if Liverpool win the next 3 to 4 games, he's then sitting around because somebody has come in and shown themselves to be capable. So it's always a delicate balancing act in terms of looking at the budget. And remember, it's not just a transfer fee. Realistically, somebody who's joining Liverpool is going to be expecting a salary of £3 to £4 million a year. If they sign on a 2.5 year contract, then that cost accelerates in terms of the overall cost of the club. And for all we know, that Liverpool might have their sights on making a signing in June. And therefore, the person who they have signed in January then becomes surplus to requirements. How would it work, say, if Liverpool were to get somebody on loan? I mean, obviously the finances of that would be different, but would that be a possibility for Liverpool?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are players
who are surplus to requirements elsewhere, and loan signings can certainly work. Again, you've got to ask yourself, why are those players not getting first team football where they are presently? So if they're not good enough for a team in Europe or another team in the Premier League, would they actually be an upgrade as far as Liverpool are concerned, in respect of any issues that are to do with the defence? But certainly a loan to the end of the season is affordable and it's feasible. But Liverpool play to a certain style in terms of the way that Jurgen Klopp likes football. Would the player be able to adapt quickly enough to actually make an impact between now and the end of the season? Having said that, we're only 19 games into the season, so there are plenty of games to play before the final positions are confirmed.
I suppose what Liverpool fans would say is it's not just a risk in terms of the footballing side of things, getting into the Champions League, that's important as well. But there's a few other sort of impacts as well. I don't think there's any sort of direct link with the Nike kit deal, for example, if they didn't get into the Champions League. But I suppose you'd have to say that if it's a disappointing season for Liverpool, if they don't maybe win something this season, there will be a knock-on effect in terms of revenues and other streams of income as well.
Yes, good news sells merchandise, and football clubs are aware of that, and I'm sure everybody at Anfield is striving to achieve that aim. The Nike deal will have step-ups, it will have bonuses embedded into it for achieving particular goals. Now, those could be linked to on-field performance, they could be linked to the volume of sales themselves, for all we know, but there's no doubt there is a positive correlation between clubs that win football matches and the number of pieces of merchandise that are sold, because fans at the end of a match, even if it's a match which is taking place on television, they tend to feel good about things. And if they feel bad, they'll go onto social media and moan. If they feel good, they're more inclined to say, well, such and such scored a goal. I've been thinking about that third kit, but it's a bit of a weird colour. But they just won 4 in a row. Tell you what, I'll take it on. It's small issues, sort of individual match performances, which can tilt. And if it's a few people at each match, then that adds up over the course of the season. So certainly Nike will be desperate for Liverpool to get into the Champions League as much as the fans, because the Champions League is a very good vehicle for displaying the wares of Nike themselves. It's free publicity every time a team the calibre of Liverpool goes onto the field of play for a big match in Europe.
I suppose that must be the reason why Nike was so keen to get Liverpool in the first place. I suppose it must be a bit of a disappointment for them if Liverpool aren't up to the standards of what they've been in previous years, because this was the club that they'd strived and even went into court to try and get hold of.
Yes, but if we go back, it's only 3 years ago that Liverpool finished 4th in the Premier League, and everybody seemed happy about that. The amazing achievements of 2019 and 2020 have set a new benchmark. Nobody's guaranteed places in the Champions League, in the Premier League these days, which is a good thing in my view as a neutral. And nobody has a right. So whilst we have a competitive league, and we do, because of the way that the money is distributed presently in the Premier League, then we're effectively looking at 6 into 4, 5 into 4 at the start of each season. There's a case for saying that Arsenal have dropped out of competition in terms of their ability to qualify for Champions League places, but the fact that it isn't a guarantee actually helps the clubs in some way, because again it drives viewers and it helps in terms of broadcasting and negotiations and collaborations with commercial partners.
Yeah, Liverpool, obviously, the Champions League qualification and that sort of thing is very much in their own hands. The fact that there's no fans inside Anfield, very much not in their hands. I think it's been 3 games where they've had 2,000 fans in each, and they're taking a 3 million or so hit per game. So that is a huge sort of contributing factor, I think, to the fact that in 1920, Liverpool, their revenue dropped by £43 million. I mean, that was obviously a season in which they won the Premier League for the first time in 30 years. And I suppose we can't underestimate the impact of the pandemic as well. I mean, how much do you think that will have played into the fact that Liverpool aren't signing anyone this month? And probably a lot of other teams across the country are not signing anybody either.
Well, you're absolutely right, Matt. If we take a look at there's two issues. That there's the quantity of deals, and then there's the value of deals. As far as the summer 2020 market was concerned, it was noticeable that there were no €100 million plus signings made. And this was for two reasons. Prices had dropped in the market because selling clubs tended to be a little bit more desperate to sell, and buying clubs didn't necessarily have the money to spend. And secondly, from a cultural point of view, the Premier League has come in for criticism from politicians for the amount of spending that did take place. And the Premier League spent more money than anywhere else in Europe. I mean, the Premier League spent twice as much as La Liga or the Bundesliga or these and Serie A. So the Premier League was very much where it was at, even in a subdued market. But the negotiators on behalf of the Premier League, they were actually quite relieved at the lack of spending, because they were going into board or Zoom conversations, as we all do these days, with politicians, with civil servants, and putting forward the case for allowing elite sport to return. And because of it's the only thing in town at present. There's no live TV as such, with the exception of news channels, which are extremely depressing, and a limited amount of sport. So I think for the good of the nation's health, in terms of the football fan base, that was part of the case that was put forward. What they didn't want is politicians to turn around, as they have done on more than one occasion, and use football as a convenient excuse for the failures in terms of track and trace and health issues and broader issues. So football became a focal point for COVID in some ways, and I think that the relative lack of spending in the transfer market has perhaps helped the Premier League in its ongoing negotiations. But nobody's spending money. If we take a look at where we are today, we're into the last week of the window, and who signed anybody? It's common. Clubs such as Manchester United, they're losing £4 million a match. Spurs are doing the same. Liverpool 3 to 3.5. Arsenal the same. So if you're taking that financial hit, what you do in business is that you look at the things which you have to pay out, which for football clubs are wages, and some of the core overheads, the electricity, the insurance, and things of that nature, and then discretionary spending. It's the same as you or I, Matt, when we get to the week before payday. It's Saturday night. We look at our bank balance. We say, well, I'd like to go out. I'd like to go and see my mates. I'd like to have a few scoops. In a non-COVID world, of course. But I can't do so because it's financially irresponsible. And that's the same for, I think, for many boardrooms as far as football clubs are concerned.
You mentioned La Liga there, and obviously the big two, Barcelona and Real Madrid, they seem to be struggling financially. We've seen Barcelona's accounts come out earlier this week. I mean, Liverpool, as much as they might not be in a position to go out and spend loads and loads of money, they seem to be in a better position than both of those clubs, which I think if you'd have said that a few years ago, that would have just been laughed at, wouldn't it?
Yes. Relative to those clubs, I think Liverpool are in a strong position, and I think you've got to give credit to the management team for getting there, because they've made the right decisions on the pitch and off the pitch, so that they've been sort of in a virtuous circle in terms of looking at new ways of generating money. And in the Deloitte report, which came out, I think it was interesting to say that Liverpool have been at the forefront of digitizing. It's a horrible management speak word, of digitizing the fan base, in finding new ways of engaging with them. And once you start to engage with people a bit more, then you can start to offer them things which might be of interest, and those things could cost money. And this is a way of generating extra revenue. Liverpool, because they're in the Premier League, are in a relatively stronger position than clubs in La Liga, because the Premier League TV deal is the most lucrative in the world. And if we take a look at both Barcelona and Real Madrid, they both have huge stadiums, which generate vast amounts of money on a match day. A greater proportion of their revenue comes from match day than is the case for Liverpool. Then they've also got, in terms of 7-day engagement with fans, their museums, their stadium tours are more lucrative because more money's been invested in them historically. I think it's issues of that nature that that Liverpool will be wanting to address in due course. I mean, I was talking to a chief executive of a club last week who said that during when we were in Tier 2, for those heady days, he went with his family to the new Spurs stadium, and they went on the walk over the top of the stadium. You know, there's this roof walk, and he said by the time he'd paid for that, for a trip to the museum, for him and a couple of kids, bought a little bit of merchandise, it was 250 quid. And there were lots of people doing that because, you know, there were some tourists there were some fans there who hadn't managed to see their team play. And it's issues of this nature, which I think Barcelona and Real Madrid historically have been good at. I think it's something that Liverpool's owners are keen to address in due course. If you go to Anfield on a non-match day, there's not a lot happening. And I think it's something which they will be keen to develop. And that's the nature of the relationship with FSG.
Yeah, I mean, moving on a little bit towards more sort of the footballing side of things. I mean, Liverpool have a lot of new contracts to think about over the next couple of seasons or so. Some big players in need of renewals, not least Mohamed Salah and Virgil van Dijk. But it's the same situation for a few other teams as well. Kylian Mbappe keeps being linked with Liverpool. I don't think that's massively realistic, to be honest, with the sums of money that would be involved in that. But he does only have 12 months left on his PSG contract this summer. So it's not just Liverpool, it's across the world, really. There's a sort of balance to be struck, isn't there, between getting these new contracts to sort of keep hold of these players, but at the same time, even if PSG were forced into selling someone as big as Mbappe, they probably wouldn't get the money that they'd want for him. But equally, a club probably couldn't even afford to pay 150 or so million this summer for a player with 12 months left on their contract. So there's some big decisions, I suppose, is what I'm getting at, in terms of players all across Europe, in terms of Liverpool as well as other big clubs.
Yes, it's always a challenging act for clubs and executives in terms of the way that they look at the budgets going forwards. And you know, Liverpool will have a big spreadsheet with the names of all the players who are first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice in terms of individual positions when their contracts expire, matching those to existing members of the squad, and they will be doing assessments, and they will be saying, well, is this player an upgrade or at the same level of our existing squad, and those will be the parameters that will be used to drive players. We've seen Manchester United with Paul Pogba. They extended his contract. They took up an option because otherwise he could potentially have left this summer on a Bosman. He's mysteriously discovered some form in recent matches, just at a time when he would be quite a saleable asset and be able to negotiate a very lucrative contract as he moves towards the last year of his existing relationship with Manchester United. Again, the club might choose to renew it. It might not. It might choose to cash in. And that is the same all across Europe. Lionel Messi's contract is out. Ends this summer. Is he going to sign a new one at Barcelona? Is he going to come to the Premier League? Could he be involved in a swap for Mbappe? All of this stuff it keeps us engaged with the game at a time when we are sort of seeking for some form of respite from the ravages of COVID.
But in terms of that, and in terms of these contracts, I mean, is there almost an argument to say that if COVID does have an impact over, say, the next couple of years in terms of a knock-on effect, whether that's direct or indirect, maybe we see a few more players leave on free transfers? Because if you look at all of these players who possibly will be needing new contracts. You mentioned Messi there as well, of course, is a huge player and somebody that would be very, very valuable in terms of his contract, in terms of a new deal. Is there almost an argument to say that clubs might sort of go down a route of letting these players go down to a free contract, and just in the knowledge that there'll be others that they could replace them with on the same basis?
Yes, there is. I mean, we could move to more of a swap relationship. One of the biggest transfers last summer was Arthur going to Juve and Pjanic going to Barcelona. And that reduces certain elements of fees, reduces certain elements of debts, and things of that nature. Clubs are looking at ways of reducing their external costs. It has been mentioned, I think, in the newspapers in the last couple of days that the Barcelona owe over 100 million in terms of outstanding transfers. But if you take a look at the Premier League, that applies to a lot of clubs there. The Premier League collectively owes over £1.5 billion in outstanding instalments on transfers. So whilst fans are saying, well, who are we going to pay? Who are we going to buy in this window and the next window? They're ignoring the fact that the club might already be into a six-figure sum in terms of 100 million or more for players that they signed over the course of the last couple of years, and therefore the club has no money to pay for somebody new due to the impact of COVID, the reduction in matchday income, the rebates which have had to be given to broadcasting companies, and the fact that some sponsors are trying to renew on lower terms because they say, it's not what we paid for. Everybody has concluded that football taking place in empty stadiums is not what we sign up for as fans, either attending. Clearly, we can't attend the matches, but even as armchair fans. And again, all I can say is that speaking to somebody at a club at a high position recently, he says the only possible good thing which could come out of COVID is that those clubs which have held fans in contempt, they just used them as people to be monetized, to be patronized, and to be relieved of cash. That they've now got to up their game, because there's no guarantee that football matches will sell out when we come out of lockdown. For economic reasons, millions of people will have been made unemployed or will be on part-time employment and have incurred debts as a result of COVID, and will be focusing on those. And B, that there will be caution amongst many parts of the population in terms of, is it healthy? Is it safe to attend football? And I think that will be a cultural issue which will take time to address. If people are in vulnerable groups, if they have been shielding, they might feel that attending a football match with 40, 50, 60, 70,000 people there is a step too far, and therefore they don't renew their season tickets, or therefore they don't apply for match day tickets. The football industry is going to have to work harder to sell tickets than it has done in the past.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting few seasons to follow, I think, isn't it? And looking ahead in terms of the transfer market in the summer, there's sort of been a few suggestions from various places that if Liverpool don't spend this summer, if they don't spend, for example, on a centre-back, they might be able to go and do something in the summer. But do you think that's realistic for not just Liverpool, but I suppose for all the big teams, but Liverpool in particular, to go and have a big summer of spending? Or has the impact of COVID sort of lessened the likelihood of that at all?
The numbers are likely to be down overall, because in 2020 we had 3 months of matches behind closed doors. That will be extended to 12 months for this summer. Clubs are also aware, buying clubs, that whilst the Premier League has been hit, continental Europe has taken a much bigger hit. There is a greater reliance upon matchday income. We've seen the French TV deal with MediaPro collapse, and French football is facing a more severe financial crisis than English, than the Premier League. So I think that will be a natural driver of fees going down, and there is less money to spend. there will be a few exceptions. Those clubs which are funded by ultra high net worth individuals. So I think we have to be realistic. We are talking Chelsea and Manchester City here, are far more immune from the ravages and the financial consequences of COVID than a club such as Liverpool or indeed Manchester United, who have American owners who are more focused on the financial model. Roman Abramovich, it doesn't bother him if the club loses money. His focus, as we've seen last summer, spent £250 million because it's loose change to him. There's a far stricter financial model operating via FSG, and that has plenty of merits. It doesn't put the club into the same degree of risk as we see when things can go wrong at clubs who have been relegated. When Aston Villa went down, they nearly went out of business. We saw Sunderland go down and slipped into League One, and we see lots of clubs borrowing money from sources which indicate that the clubs are now seen at high risk. If a football club is paying interest of 9, 10, 11%, and that's what some of the loans are from the new lenders, that's reflecting the fact that they're not convinced that there's 100% certainty of the club being able to make the instalments on time. Otherwise, somebody would have come in and lent the club money at a much lower rate.
And I suppose in terms of transfers, it works both ways, doesn't it? Just to finish off, I mean, for Liverpool, obviously, there might be opportunities, say, in France to go and get a player perhaps a little bit cheaply. But at the other end of the spectrum, maybe they missed out a little bit in terms of sales. You think of Shaqiri, Marco Grujic, Harry Wilson, players like that. They now won't be able to get the same sorts of figures that they would have hoped for those players.
Yes, I agree entirely with you. I mean, sort of what we might call mid-tier players in terms of the expected fees. The whole market has collapsed, or has fallen, and the mid-tier players, there has been a greater proportionate acceleration in the decline of fees. And the reason for that is that historically there had been a lot of clubs who were willing to pay somewhere in the in the £8 to £15 million bracket. And an awful lot of those clubs are now saying, we're just going to do Bosmans, we're just going to do loans. And therefore, clubs trying to sell players in that particular price bracket are finding it more difficult.
Yeah, certainly. Kieran, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate your time this morning. And if anyone wants to know more about any of these topics, I'm sure they can check out your podcast, which if you would like to give that a plug now, feel free.
Yeah, it's the Price of Football podcast. It's the podcast that should never have been successful, and in an ideal world shouldn't exist, because it's all about the business of football and some of the scary stories about money in the game. And unfortunately, at present, there's too many of them.
Yeah, certainly not at FSG, though, which I think we should probably remember a little bit more frequently with Liverpool. Kieran, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
I'm now joined by the Echo's business of football writer, Dave Powell, to talk through a few different money and finance topics from this week as well. And Dave, I want to start with one of the bigger Liverpool stories of the week, I think, in that RedBall acquisitions and FSG. It seems that deal is now off the table. Officially, it was never on the table to begin with, I don't think, on the record. But we do know that they were sort of starting to go down that route. It seems that won't be the case now. What's the sort of latest story behind that, and why is that seemingly broken down?
Well, it's for the main reason being that when RedBall produced their IPO back in the summer, they raised about $575 million, and that was the first kind of tranche of investment that they received. And what they needed to do was raise another kind of 975 million to kind of get that 20% stake in FSG. But ultimately, what appears to have happened is that they've not been able to do that, not been able to get the investment that they need, largely because kind of institutional investors, so companies that operate on behalf of investing clients, they've kind of wanted a bit more equity and a bit more value from kind of what the deal was offering, and ultimately it's hinged upon that. There's been no breakdown in relationship. If anything, the relationships could well manifest itself in Jerry Cardinal possibly going down the private investment route into FSG. But I think in terms of the whole Billy Beane, I mean, that was like the fun part of it, I think. But I think that now seems that Beane will kind of focus his efforts on Oakland for the coming season in the MLB. And then RedBall will probably look to kind of move into the European football market again, or possibly esports, which is a huge growth market, because it's something which, that basically when the IPO was raised, RedBall, then the clock starts ticking, so they had 24 months in which to secure invest them. Otherwise, once that passes, investors' monies go back to the investors. The clock's ticking on that. So I think it was in the interest of all parties to kind of break it off as soon as it realised it wasn't going to be something which they could kind of strike a deal on. But yeah, we could well see kind of Redbird, which is Jerry Cardinal's private equity firm, invest in FSG in the future.
So what do you think comes next for FSG? Is it still the plan to go down that route, but maybe go about it in a slightly different way then? Is that the most likely sort of next step for them?
I don't think public listing is probably going to happen in the short term now. This could well be a precursor to possibly happening in a few years' time. I mean, these things have a way of working like that. But sporting organisations, in the main, when they are publicly listed, they are smaller than the kind of other traditional businesses that go on the stock market. So it's about creating value from that. I think what might happen, I mean, the idea behind it was really to try and capitalise the business. So once you raise, you go on the stock market, you can raise money. I think the idea was to raise about 450 million, kind of straight off the bat. I mean, that's for FSG, so that could have been used to capitalise the business and possibly help strengthen both the Red Sox, Liverpool, and also kind of Roush Fenway Racing. But I think what will happen now is they're still seeking private investment. That seems to be the case, and I think Jerry Cardinal and Henry have a good relationship. They're already well aligned because they were quite far down the road with this. And from what I'm told from people close to it, the talks are still ongoing about that. But I think the anything involving Beane is probably now off the table.
Yeah, which sort of seems a little bit of a shame, doesn't it? We know the relationship between Billy Beane, John Henry, and that sort of thing. It sort of seems like Liverpool will miss out in a sense in that way. But I suppose it's not the end of the road in this. As you say, it's a case of finding a different way of going about it. Whether that's without Billy Beane, it can still be beneficial for Liverpool in the long term.
I think the Beane idea was fun because, I mean, people who've seen Moneyball, it's a great film. The whole narrative behind the story is great. It's statistical analysis and kind of sabermetrics are something which Henry utilised through Theo Epstein when he took over at when they took over at the Red Sox. So and Jerry Cardinals has an interest in that. He's bought kind of similar business ventures that look into kind of data driven analytics and things like that. So it's all kind of well aligned. But I think the idea for Beane was this was to be his kind of final fling with baseball last season, and then he was going to move into something new. And the idea being, he already has small minority shareholdings in Barnsley and AZ Alkmaar in Holland, and he's he has a real interest in kind of expanding that. And I think his kind of knowledge would have come into play in terms of building that football club portfolio, that kind of multi-club platform that you kind of see with City Football Group at Man City and RedBall with RB Leipzig. So, I mean, that could still transpire eventually, although through Cardinal, because I mean, Jerry Cardinal through Redbird, who is the firm that could well invest in Liverpool privately, he bought Toulouse in France last summer, where Damien Comolli has been installed as chairman fairly soon after. Damien Comolli is also a friend of Billy Beane, so it's all these things kind of link back into one giant circle. So that could be on the table, but I think the Beane aspect of it was Billy Beane was supposed to drive forward that kind of multi-platform, multi-club platform, And I think now it could well be that they try and just separate that and look elsewhere. And esports is something which is a huge growth market, and that's ultimately, I think he's after a new challenge, but he is staying with the Oakland Athletics through this current MLB season, which is set to run till the end of November. So for the time being, that's what's on his plate.
Yeah, definitely. We'll come back to baseball and the Red Sox in just a second. But before we do that, I know there's another story that you've covered this week. The Deloitte Money League table has been released again, the latest version of that. Liverpool into the top 5, ahead of Manchester City, only the 2 Spanish clubs, Bayern Munich and Manchester United, ahead of them. Obviously, those all sound good. The fact that Liverpool have moved ahead of Manchester City is never going to be a bad thing. But what does that actually mean for Liverpool, and why is this important?
First of all, yes, but these tables are a good indication of the ability for these clubs to generate revenue. But ultimately, if you flip the script and look at the top 2 teams of Barcelona and Real Madrid, they're enormously debt laden. Barcelona are facing the prospect of having to go back to banks in which they have huge loans with, asking for a deferral of payment in order to meet their obligations. So there's just one doesn't necessarily mean the other, if you get my point. But what it does show, I think, is it's the first time since Liverpool have appeared in this list since 2001-2 season. But it's kind of been traded off the back of their success in Europe, mainly. Because that Champions League season managed to rake in over 100 million for the football club. If it was just be, and that figure would go up this season if they were to, if success is achieved. But they've managed to been very good at leveraging success on the pitch, with financial success off it. But kind of, I suppose, with what it does bring into focus is the fact that their kind of reluctance to spend big in this transfer window. It means seeing them appear in this list is bound to rankle with supporters, and understandably so. There is more of a colder, harder aspect to running Liverpool as a business, I think, as opposed to, it's not the Wild West of spending. They're very sensible with their spending. It's been and this isn't to knock it at all. It's been a model which has served them remarkably well. When you look at some of the deals which they've managed to kind of negotiate since they've come in. So Coutinho signed for 8 million, sold for 142. Suarez, huge uptick in the money they received from that. Salah's value has increased threefold, same as Sadio Mane. So these are and Virgil van Dijk as well. They paid a huge amount of money for Virgil van Dijk, and he's still, and even still now, they probably realised 45-50 million pound on top of that. So they've been hugely clever in being able to do that. But in terms of revenue streams, they've been able to commercially get some strong deals done. The Nike deal doesn't fall into this accounting period. I think you're going to see the benefit of that Nike deal probably in 21 accounts, 22 season accounts. So once all that kicks in, so the royalties kick in, because that's the big thing. £30 million a year from the Nike deal, and the big thing is going to be the 20% kickback on the licensed merchandise, which is ultimately where you're going to see the growth of the brand. And there is some expectation that might push the figure above 70 million, which would see them probably just behind Manchester United and their huge Adidas deal that they have. But yeah, it's a case of the club is being managed tremendously well off the pitch. Jurgen Klopp does a fantastic job of managing it on the pitch. But it's a case of kind of marrying those two things moving forward, because there is a real risk that they tread water, and this kind of appearance in the top 5 of the Money League, however good it is, means that it's kind of a stick to beat them with now, because obviously people see that there's money coming into the business. It's a strong position compared to some. So the questions posed: why did 8 Premier League sides spend more than them in the past year? So it's there's difficult questions to ask, and it doesn't look like they're going to pull a trigger on anything in this transfer window. But you worry that this might become kind of a running theme in terms of a stick to beat them with, because people see the club now doing so well. and it's one of those things. The two things have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose just to go back to the Red Sox and baseball, I suppose we could almost learn from what they've done during the pandemic and during coronavirus, and sort of assume that they're going to run Liverpool in a similar sort of way. I know that the two teams are very much separate entities within FSG. They don't, apply necessarily the same tactics to each of them. But how have the Red Sox been dealing with this? I think there's been contracts, there's been star player issues over there as well, which I suppose you could say with the likes of Mohamed Salah could apply at Anfield too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on something around this as well. So it's basically it's important to stress that they are completely separate entities business wise. One, what one does doesn't necessarily follow with what another does. But the Red Sox is something which FSG have been so entwined with for almost 20 years now. They won the World Series in 2018 last, and the following season they tanked big style because I think there was some expectation that afforded FSG a little bit of wiggle room, because American sports is very different in terms of there is always an acceptance that a transitional period follows, not necessarily follows success, but in order to achieve success, there's no real dynasties in American sport, and there are big market teams who have achieved success, but there's no guarantee of these teams. If you look through American sport, whether it's the NBA, whether it's the NFL, whether it's the MLB, there are huge teams, big market teams, which will always drive the big money and get the big players, but it doesn't necessarily translate to success. There's always a period of transition. So FSG have kind of took the opportunity, I think, after that World Series success to take their foot off the gas. And I'm not saying that kind of parallels into, obviously Liverpool won the Premier League last season, won the Champions League the year before that. So it's interesting to see if they understand that football fandom doesn't accept that. These periods of, it's going to, the period of transition to Liverpool to become Premier League champions was 30 years. So it's not, it's not like I don't think it's right to expect fans to think, well, we'll just wait and see what happens, and the next time we win the league. There is an expectation now, because Liverpool positioned themselves at the very top of the English game again, to push forward with that. And there's a few things which you look at stateside at what's gone on, and they implemented wage cuts at the Red Sox at the pandemic for staff, some players, and then they also Mookie Betts was one of their star players last season. The decision was taken to trade him early doors, rather than offer a contract which they weren't really willing to meet the money that would need to be paid. You can understand the idea behind that, because it secures some kind of value for him before risking losing him as a free agent, because they're able to get trades and cash equivalents and things like that. But if you were to flip the script and look at that in the situation they might face with Mo Salah or someone like that, whereby would they be willing to sell just because they'd be able to recoup, or do they hedge their bets and pay what's needed to keep their star players? So that's obviously not happened at the Red Sox, whereby they still operate this mantra. It's important to note that Henry's kind of desire to work with Beane comes from how Beane managed to get value out of players which nobody else saw value in. So that kind of takes away, ownership loves that, because it takes away the need to spend big money on big players in their prime, when you can just kind of pad out your roster with people who can pick up the stats and give you success on a far smaller budget. So you can understand why his interest to work with Beane all those years ago. But I do think that you can't immediately assume that one approach in America will translate into what they've done here. They actually used the kind of the US government's equivalent of the furlough scheme, which they tried to implement kind of with real kind of lack of success over here. I mean, it was always going to be it was always a bad decision, and it's one of the kind of the real missteps that they've made since they've been owners of Liverpool. But with Roush Fenway Racing and their NASCAR team, they actually use kind of the government's the US government's equivalent of the furlough scheme there. So it's not without kind of some similarities across the board. But there's also the notion of how does it look if to Red Sox fans, although the two are completely separate entities, what does it look like if they spend big on Liverpool in this transfer window, yet they implemented staff cuts and were willing to let go their star player or trade their star player instead of offering him a big deal? So, I think while they may say that that's not an issue, the two things are separate. Reality is they're owned by the same company, and public perception is everything. So they're a real sticky situation at the moment, FSG, in terms of it's the most delicate time in their relationship with Liverpool fans, I think. And they'll have to it'd be interesting to see the steps they take, because they'll be very careful in terms of souring what has been a good relationship and a fruitful one so far.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance, isn't it? Making sure they get those decisions right, and plenty of big contract decisions coming up as well. We're going to run a series across Blood Red looking at those different decisions over the next few weeks. So do keep an eye out for that. But that just about brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you very much to Kieran Maguire, first of all, and then Dave Powell just now for their insight. That's all we've got time for here today, though, on this Blood Red podcast. From myself, Matt Addison, from Kieran and from Dave, thanks for listening. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.